Welcome to the Oracle's Rest, a place where stories unfold slowly, where time softens, and where the mind is free to wander. Tonight, we drift back across the centuries to the world of the Aztecs, to a great city built upon a lake, to floating gardens and feathered serpents, to maize and moonlight and the counting of the days. Tonight is a collection of 100 small facts about the Aztecs. Gentle things, quiet things, slow truths about a people, their gods, and their gardens, gathered together to carry you softly towards sleep. The people we call the Aztecs did not often call themselves by that name. They called themselves the Mexica, and it is from them that the country of Mexico takes its name to this day. The word Aztec came later, drawn from the name of their legendary homeland, and it has come to stand for the whole great civilization that flourished in the valley of central Mexico. They spoke a language called Nahuatl, soft and flowing, full of gentle sounds. And though their empire is long gone, the language is not. More than 1 million people still speak Nahuatl today in the towns and villages of Mexico. The living echo of the tongue once spoken in the markets and palaces of the Aztec world. And we ourselves speak a little Nahuatl without ever knowing it. Many everyday words came to us from that language, carried across the world over the centuries. Chocolate, tomato, avocado, chili, coyote. Each of these words began as a Nahuatl word, and each still carries a small piece of the Aztec world quietly within it. The old stories say that the Mexica came from a distant homeland in the north, a place called Aztlan, the place of whiteness, or the place of herons. From there, the legends tell, they set out long ago on a great wandering, searching for the place where they were meant to build their home, guided by their God across many years and many miles. Their God, the stories say, had promised them a sign. They would know the place to settle when they saw an eagle perched upon a prickly pear cactus, growing from a rock in the middle of a lake. For generations they wandered and waited, unwelcome in the lands of others, always moving on, always watching for the promised sign. At last, on a small marshy island in the waters of Lake Texcoco, they saw it, an eagle resting upon a cactus, exactly as the prophecy had foretold. And there, on that island in the lake, in the year we count as 1325, they began to build their city. They named it Tenochtitlan. That ancient sign has never been forgotten. The eagle, perched upon its cactus, appears to this day at the very center of the flag of Mexico, a symbol of the nation reaching back across 700 years to a vision seen by a wandering people on a lake. The founding image of the Aztecs still flies over their descendants. To build a city on islands in the middle of a lake was no small thing. The Mexica drove wooden piles into the lake bed, piled up earth and stone, and slowly enlarged their islands, raising a great city out of the marsh and the water. What began as a few huts on a muddy island grew, over time, into one of the largest and most magnificent cities in the entire world. In the year 1428, the Mexica joined with two neighboring city-states, Texcoco and Tlacopan, in a great alliance. This triple alliance became the foundation of the empire. Together, the three cities grew rich and powerful, spreading their influence across the valley and far beyond, until the Aztec Empire reached over much of central Mexico and counted millions of people among its subjects. At its height, the capital city of Tenochtitlan held perhaps 200,000 people, and possibly more. It was far larger than most cities of Europe at the time, larger than London or Rome in that age. When travelers from across the sea first saw it rising white and gleaming from the waters of the lake, many of them could scarcely believe their eyes. The city sat in the middle of the lake, and so it was joined to the shore by long raised roads called causeways. These causeways stretched for miles across the water, wide enough for many people to walk abreast, linking the island city to the surrounding land and letting crowds stream in and out each day to the great markets and temples. The causeways had gaps in them, crossed by wooden bridges that could be lifted away. This was clever defense, for if an enemy approached, the bridges could be removed, and the city in the lake would become a fortress surrounded by water in ordinary times. Though the bridges simply carried the endless traffic of a busy capital back and forth across the lake. Within the city itself, water was everywhere. Tenochtitlan was laced with canals, like the streets of a watery city, and much travel was done by canoe. Goods and people slipped quietly along the waterways in countless small boats, gliding between the islands and gardens. To move through the Aztec capital was often to move by water, paddling softly down lanes of rippling light. But the water of the lake was not always good to drink, for parts of it were salty. So the Aztecs built an aqueduct, a great channel of stone and mortar to carry fresh spring water into the city from the hill of Chapultepec on the mainland. Clean water flowed along this raised channel into the heart of Tenochtitlan, supplying the fountains and households of the city. At the very center of the city stood a great sacred precinct, walled around, holding the most important temples and buildings. Rising above it all was the Templo Mayor, the great temple, a tall, stepped pyramid crowned with two shrines side by side. It was the spiritual heart of the Aztec world, the meeting place. They believed of earth and heaven. The Aztecs kept their city remarkably clean. The streets were swept daily, and there were people whose work it was to keep the city tidy. Even human waste was carefully collected rather than left to foul the streets, and it was carried away to be used, put to work as fertilizer for the fields or in the making of other goods. Few cities of that age were so well ordered. Joined to Tenochtitlan was its sister city, Tlatelolco, and there stood the greatest market in all the Aztec world. Each day, tens of thousands of people gathered there to buy and sell. The visitors from across the sea wrote, in amazement that they had never seen so vast a market, so well ordered, with such an endless variety of goods laid out in their proper rows. In that great market, one could find almost anything: maize and beans and chili, fish and turkeys and game, cloth and sandals and rope, gold and feathers and gemstones, herbs and medicines, pottery and tools and dyes. Each kind of thing had its own section, and officials walked among the stalls to settle disputes and make sure that all was fair. The Aztecs had no coins of metal as money. Instead, for small purchases, people often used cacao beans, the very beans from which chocolate is made, counting them out one by one for larger trades. Lengths of fine cotton cloth served as a kind of currency. So, in the Aztec world, money could be something you could drink or something you could wear. Now, the wonder that fed this great city was a marvel of farming. The chinampas, sometimes called the floating gardens. These were long, narrow plots of rich farmland built right out into the shallow waters of the lake. They were not truly floating, but anchored, raised garden beds rising just above the water, surrounded by canals on every side. To make a chinampa, the farmers staked out a rectangle in the shallow lake and built up its walls with reeds and stakes and woven mats. Then they piled the plot high with mud dredged from the lake bottom and with rotting plants, layer upon layer, until it rose above the water as a bed of dark, rich soil, ready to be planted. To hold the chinampas firm, the farmers planted willow trees along their edges. The roots of the willows reached down and bound the soil together, anchoring the garden plots against the water and giving shade and shelter. Over time, these rows of willows turned the lake into a green and orderly landscape of gardens and trees and shining canals. The chinampas were astonishingly fertile, watered constantly from the canals on every side, enriched by the black lake mud. They could be planted and harvested again and again throughout the year, yielding crop after crop. This wonderful farmland, rising straight out of the lake, was one of the secrets that allowed so great a city to feed itself. On the chinampas and in the fields, beyond grew the foods that were the heart of Aztec life. Above all, there was maize, what we call corn, the most important crop of all. There were beans and squash, chili peppers and tomatoes, amaranth and sage, and bright flowers grown both for beauty and for the gods. The gardens of the lake fed the people in body and in spirit alike. Maize, beans, and squash were often grown together, the three great crops planted side by side. The tall maize gave the beans something to climb. The beans enriched the soil, and the broad squash leaves shaded the ground and kept it moist. Grown together in this way, the three crops helped one another flourish. A quiet partnership of plants worked out over many centuries. Maize was so central to life that it was almost sacred. From it, the people made their daily bread, grinding the kernels into dough and patting them into flat, round cakes cooked on a clay griddle. The tortillas still eaten across Mexico today. From the same dough, they made tamales, little parcels of maize wrapped in leaves and steamed, filled with all manner of good things. The Aztecs knew a clever secret for making their maize more nourishing. They soaked the dried kernels in water mixed with ash or lime before grinding them. This softened the maize and, though they could not have known the reason, made its goodness far easier for the body to use. This patient old method, worked out long ago, is still used to make maize dough to this day. Beside the maize, the Aztecs grew amaranth, a tiny grain borne on tall plants with deep red and gold plumes. Amaranth was nourishing and important, eaten as a grain and sometimes popped, like little seeds over the fire. They grew chia as well. The small seeds we still know today, valued as a strengthening food for long journeys and hard work. One of the most useful plants of all was the maguey, a great spiky agave that grew across the dry highlands. From the maguey, the people drew fibre for thread and rope and cloth, and even the sharp tip of its leaf served as a needle, with the plant's own fibres still attached as thread. Almost no part of the maguey went to waste. The maguey also gave a drink. From the heart of the plant, the Aztecs drew a sweet sap, and when this sap was left to ferment, it became a mild, milky alcoholic drink called pulque. Pulque was old and honored, bound up with certain gods and festivals, but ordinary drunkenness was frowned upon, and among most people it was reserved for elders and for special occasions. And then there was chocolate, perhaps the most famous gift of the Aztec world. It was made from the beans of the cacao tree, which were roasted, ground, and mixed with water into a drink. But it was nothing like the sweet chocolate we know now. It was a bitter, frothy drink, often spiced with chili or flavored with vanilla and other aromatics. Chocolate was a luxury, a drink of nobles and warriors and wealthy merchants. Not an everyday thing for ordinary people. It was prized for giving strength and lifting the spirits. The Aztecs poured it from a height between vessels to raise a thick foam upon the top, and that frothy foam was considered the very best part of the drink. For their meat, the Aztecs kept turkeys, which were native to the land and raised in great numbers, and a kind of small, hairless dog. They hunted deer and rabbits and other game, and the lake itself gave a rich harvest of fish, frogs, and waterfowl, and even insects and their eggs, gathered from the reeds and the shallows as good and ordinary food. The Aztecs even gathered a kind of blue-green algae from the surface of the lake, skimming it off and pressing it into cakes to be dried and eaten. It was rich and nourishing, a food drawn straight from the water, and one more way that the people of the lake made use of every gift their watery home could offer. The Aztecs farmed without some of the tools we might expect. They had no plows and no large animals to pull them, no horses or oxen, and they did not use the wheel for work. The farmer worked the earth with a simple pointed digging stick by hand, and yet from this patient labor came harvests enough to feed one of the great cities of the world. Let us turn now from the gardens to the heavens, to the way the Aztecs understood the world and its making. They believed in a great many gods and powers, a vast and intricate web of the divine, governing the sun and the rain, the maize and the wind, birth and death, and every turning of the seasons. The Aztec world was alive with sacred presence in every direction. At the heart of their understanding lay the belief that the world had been created and destroyed many times before. They spoke of the suns, the great ages of the world. 4 suns, 4 worlds had risen and been destroyed before the present one, and the age in which they lived was the fifth sun, the fifth and current creation of the world. Each of the earlier worlds, the stories told, had ended in its own great catastrophe. One age was destroyed by jaguars, another swept away by wind, another consumed by a rain of fire, and another drowned in a great flood. Each sun had its time and then was ended, and each ending gave way at last to a new beginning. The fifth sun, their own, was said to have been made at the ancient ruined city of Teotihuacan, where the gods gathered in the darkness to bring forth a new sun. The world we know was understood as a fragile and hard-won thing, the latest in a long line of creations, born out of the sacrifice and effort of the gods in the dark, before the dawn, in the making of this fifth sun. The old story tells the gods needed one of their number to leap into a great fire and rise again as the sun. A proud and wealthy god hesitated at the edge of the flames, but a small, humble, sickly god named Nanahuatzin cast himself bravely into the fire. And so it was the humble one who rose into the sky as the sun. It is a tale that honors courage and humility above pride. Among the greatest of the Aztec gods was Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, whose name joins the Quetzal bird with the serpent, the sky with the earth. He was a god of wind and of learning, of the morning star and of priestly wisdom, and he was beloved as a giver of good things. Of all the Aztec gods, the feathered serpent is perhaps the most famous and the most gentle. The old stories told that it was Quetzalcoatl who gave maize to humankind. The grain, they said, was hidden away inside a great mountain, and the feathered serpent found a way to bring it out so that people could plant it and eat. In this way, the most beloved of gods was bound to the most beloved of crops, the giver of wisdom, also the giver of bread. There was another tale that said Quetzalcoatl helped to make the very people of this fifth world. He journeyed down into the land of the dead to gather the bones of the people of earlier ages. And though the Lord of the dead tried to stop him, he carried the bones away. he sprinkled them with his own blood. And from them the people of the present age were born. Set against Quetzalcoatl was Tezcatlipoca, whose name means the smoking mirror. He was a god of night and of fate, of sorcery and of hidden things, mysterious and powerful, able to see all that happened in the world through his dark obsidian mirror. The feathered serpent and the smoking mirror were rivals through many of the old stories. Light and darkness, two great forces forever circling each other. The special god of the Mexica themselves was Huitzilopochtli, whose name means the hummingbird of the south. He was a god of the sun and of war, the very god who had led the wandering people to their island in the lake. He was the patron and protector of the Mexica, and one of the two shrines atop the great temple was raised in his honor. The god of rain was Tlaloc, and he was among the oldest and most important of all. He dwelt upon the mountain tops where the clouds gather, and he sent the rain that made the maize grow. He could give the gentle rains that bring life, or hold them back and bring drought. And so the rain god was prayed to with deep devotion by a people whose lives depended on the harvest, those who died in ways connected with water, by drowning or by certain illnesses, were thought to go to the paradise of the rain god, a green and lovely place called Tlalocan. It was a garden of endless springtime, full of flowers and flowing water and gentle warmth, a place of rest and plenty watched over by Tlaloc, the kindly lord of the rain. The wife of the rain god was Calciutlicu, whose name means she of the jade skirt. She was the goddess of rivers, lakes, and streams, of all the still and flowing fresh waters of the world. She watched over those who travelled by water and over the waters that filled the lake around the city, and she was honoured in the rites of birth. When the newborn child was bathed, there were gods of the maize as well, for so precious a crop could not be without its deities. There was a young maize god and a goddess of the ripe corn and of all sustenance, honoured at the harvest. The Aztecs felt the divine in the growing grain itself and gave thanks to the powers that made the fields green and the storehouses full. There was Xochiquetzal, a lovely goddess of flowers, of love and beauty, of craft and song. She was the patroness of artists and weavers and of all who made beautiful things, and she was honored with garlands of flowers and with dancing, in a culture that loved blossoms deeply. The flower goddess held a tender and cherished place, and there was a god of the dead, Mictlantecutli, the lord of the underworld, who ruled the lowest and deepest realm, with his wife at his side. The Aztecs did not picture the underworld with fear alone, but as a place that nearly all the dead must journey to. A final destination reached only after a long and difficult passage through the dark. That journey through the underworld was thought to take 4 long years. The soul had to pass through 9 levels, crossing rivers and mountains, facing cold winds sharp as blades, traveling ever downward through the layers of the dark, until at last it reached the deepest level and found its rest. Death, to the Aztecs, was not an instant, but a long and arduous road. And on that road, the dead were thought to be helped by a dog. A small dog would meet its master at the bank of a wide, dark river and carry the soul across upon its back. For this reason, a dog was sometimes buried with the dead, a faithful companion for the journey. And the little hairless dogs of Mexico were especially linked with this gentle belief. The mother of the Mexica's own god was Coatlicue, a great and ancient earth goddess, whose name means she of the serpent skirt. She was the mother of the moon and the stars, and of Huitzilopochtli himself, a powerful figure of earth and birth and death together, the womb from which life came, and the ground to which it returned. The old story told that Coatlicue gave birth to the sun god Huitzilopochtli upon a mountain, and that at his birth he had to defend his mother from his own brothers and sister, the moon and the countless stars. The Aztecs saw in this story the daily victory of the sun, rising each dawn to drive the moon and the stars from the sky, light overcoming the darkness once again. The moon in that story was the goddess Coyolxauhqui, whose name means painted with bells, for the bells upon her cheeks, and the countless stars were the 400 brothers, the stars of the southern sky. So the Aztecs read the heavens as a family, the sun and the moon and the stars bound together in an endless cycle of conflict and return, played out across the sky each day and night. To track the turning of time, the Aztecs kept not one calendar but two, woven together. The first was a sacred count of 260 days, used for divination and for naming the days with their fortunes. The second was a solar count of 365 days, the calendar of the year and the seasons and the farming, both ran at once, side by side. The sacred count was built from 20 day signs and 13 numbers, turning together like two wheels, so that each day had its own sign and number. The signs were things of the world: the crocodile, the wind, the house, the deer, the rabbit, the water, the flower, and more. Each combination came around once in 260 days, and each carried its own meaning and its own luck. The solar year was divided into 18 months of 20 days each, which together make 360. To these were added 5 days at the end, days that were thought to be unlucky and dangerous. A time to be careful and to undertake nothing of importance. These 5 hollow days closed out the year before the cycle began again, when the two calendars were set side by side. A given day with its sacred sign and its place in the solar year would not return together until 52 years had passed. This great cycle of 52 years was a kind of century to the Aztecs, the calendar round, the long wheel within which all their dates turned. The end of each 52-year cycle was a moment of great solemnity and fear. The people believed the world itself might end as one cycle closed, and so they held the new fire ceremony. All the fires of the land were put out, and the people waited in darkness. Then, when the proper star was seen to cross the sky, a new fire was kindled, and from it flames were carried out to relight every hearth, and the world was renewed for another 52 years. The most famous object to survive from the Aztec world is a great carved stone, often called the sunstone or the calendar stone. It is an enormous disk of basalt, broad as a room and heavy beyond imagining, carved all over with signs of the days and the suns and the cosmos. At its center is a face, and around it the symbols of the world ages turn in carved rings. The Aztecs watched the sky with great care. They followed the movements of the sun and the moon, and they tracked the planet Venus, the morning and evening star, with particular attention, for it was bound up with the feathered serpent, and with their reckoning of time. Their priests were astronomers, reading the heavens to know the proper days for festivals and for planting, because each day carried its own sign and fortune. The day of a child's birth was thought to shape its destiny. A special priest, a reader of the day count, would be consulted to learn the fate written in a newborn's birthday. And sometimes the naming or the ceremonies of a child would be shifted to a luckier day if the true one seemed ill-omened. The Aztecs wrote, though not with letters as we do. They used pictures and symbols, painted signs that stood for things and sounds and numbers. Skilled scribes painted these glyphs in books, recording histories, tributes, calendars, and the lore of the gods. To read and paint these signs was a treasured skill, taught carefully to those who would become priests and keepers of knowledge. Their books were not bound like ours. They were long strips of bark paper or deer hide, coated smooth and folded back and forth like a screen, so that a whole book could be opened out in one long painted band or folded shut into a neat stack. These folding books, called codices, held the painted memory of the Aztec world. The paper itself was made from the inner bark of fig trees, beaten and smoothed into long sheets. This bark paper, called amate, was used for books and for offerings and decorations. The Aztecs made a great deal of it, and the craft of making bark paper in the old way still survives in a few villages of Mexico to this day. In their counting, the Aztecs worked not in tens, as we usually do, but in 20s. Their number system was built upon the number 20, likely from the 20 fingers and toes. And so they counted in 20s and 400s and 8,000s. the great market and the tribute rolls, and the calendars all ran on this counting by 20s. Aztec society was carefully ordered into ranks. At the top were the nobles, who held high office, owned land, and led in war and worship. Below them were the common people, the farmers and craft workers and laborers who made up the great body of the population. There were also merchants and bound servants, each with their place in the order of things. The common people were organized into groups based on neighborhood and kinship, called the calpulli. Each calpulli held land in common, ran its own school and temple, and looked after its own members. It was a kind of clan and neighborhood at once, the basic building block of the city, giving each family a place and a community to belong to. There were bound servants in the Aztec world, but their bondage was not like the slavery of some other lands. It was not passed down to one's children. A person was not born into it. A bound servant could own property, could marry freely, and could buy back their own freedom. Some entered such service to pay a debt and could leave it once the debt was cleared. The merchants held a special and honored place. The long-distance traders, called the Pochteca, traveled vast distances to far regions, bringing back precious feathers, gemstones, cacao, and other treasures. They formed their own guilds, with their own customs and their own god, and they were so trusted and so widely travelled that they sometimes served as the eyes and ears of the empire in distant lands. One of the most remarkable things about the Aztecs is that they educated all their children, both boys and girls, of every rank, in an age when schooling was a rare privilege almost anywhere in the world. The Aztecs sent every child to school. Education was not for the few, but for everyone, woven into the duties of the whole society. There were two main kinds of school. For the children of common families, there were schools that taught the skills of work and war, the history and songs and customs of the people, and the duties of a good citizen. Here, young people learned the practical arts of life and were shaped into useful and honorable members of their community. For the children of nobles, and for those destined to be priests. There were higher schools, more demanding and more learned. There the students studied, reading and painting the sacred signs, the movements of the stars, the calendar, the rituals, the law, and the fine arts of speech and poetry. From these schools came the priests, the scribes, and the leaders of the Aztec world. Girls were educated too, learning the skills of the household and of craft, and the songs and proper conduct of their people. Some girls were given to the temples for a time to serve, sweeping and tending the sacred fires and weaving cloth for the gods. Womanhood and its work were honored, and the training for it was taken seriously. The Aztecs prized fine and proper speech, and they preserved long, beautiful speeches of advice and wisdom handed down from the elders. These were called the sayings of the old ones, grave and gentle counsels on how to live well, how to be honest and humble and kind, how to speak and work and raise a family. Parents recited them to their children, passing down the wisdom of the ancestors. Marriage was a serious matter, often arranged with the help of matchmakers. Respected older women who carried proposals between families. The wedding itself included a gentle and meaningful act, the tying together of the corners of the bride's and groom's garments, knotting their clothes as a sign that their two lives were now bound into one. Midwives were deeply respected in the Aztec world, and the bringing of a child into the world was spoken of with great honor. A woman in childbirth was likened to a warrior in battle, and a woman who died bringing a child into the world was honored like a fallen warrior. Her courage remembered with the same reverence given to the bravest in war. When a baby was born, it was welcomed with ceremony and bathed with prayers, and given a name on a day chosen as fortunate. The dried cord of a newborn boy might be buried far away on a field of battle, and that of a girl buried by the hearth at home. Small acts marking the path each was thought to walk in life. In daily life, the Aztecs ate simply and well. The ordinary meal was built around maize tortillas with beans, chili peppers, tomatoes, and squash, and now and then a little meat or fish. It was a healthy and balanced way of eating, drawn from the gardens and the lake, and much of it would be familiar at a Mexican table. Even now, most people ate 2 meals a day, with the largest taken in the warm middle of the day, during a pause in the work. They drank a warm gruel of maize called atole, sometimes sweetened or spiced, a comforting everyday drink. Water and the milky pulque were drunk as well, though strong drink was kept within careful bounds for most. Houses for common people were simple, built of sun-dried mud brick or of woven reeds plastered with mud, often a single room with a hearth around a small courtyard. The homes of nobles were grander, built of stone, with many rooms and fine gardens and courtyards, but humble or grand. The Aztec home was kept clean and orderly. The Aztecs bathed often and loved a kind of steam bath, a small domed bathhouse of stone, heated until its walls were hot, would be splashed with water to fill it with steam, and there people would sweat and cleanse themselves. This steam bath was used both for cleanliness and for health, to ease aches and illness, and it is still used in parts of Mexico today. Clothing told much about a person. Common people wore garments woven from the coarse fibre of the maguey plant, while the soft cotton was reserved for those of higher rank. A man wore a loincloth and a cloak knotted at the shoulder. A woman, a skirt and a loose embroidered blouse, and the finer the cloth and the brighter the work, the higher the wearer's station. There were even laws about what people could wear. Only nobles were permitted certain things. Fine cotton, particular feathers, certain sandals and ornaments, while commoners were forbidden them. A person's dress was a kind of language, showing at a glance their rank, their deeds, and their place in the careful order of Aztec society. The Aztecs were masters of working with feathers, and this was one of their most admired arts. Skilled craft workers arranged the bright feathers of tropical birds, the shimmering green of the quetzal above all, into dazzling mosaics, headdresses, shields, and cloaks. These featherworks glowed with colour and were among the most precious treasures the Aztec world produced. The Aztecs were also fine workers of gold and of precious stones. Their goldsmiths cast and hammered delicate ornaments, and their lapidaries carved jade, turquoise, and gleaming black obsidian into beads, masks, and figures. Jade was prized above gold, valued for its deep green color, a stone bound up with water and life and all things precious. Obsidian, the dark, volcanic glass, was one of the most useful materials of all. It could be worked to an edge sharper than almost anything. And from it, the Aztecs made knives, blades, and tools of remarkable keenness, polished smooth. It also made dark mirrors, the very kind in which the smoking mirror god was said to see all things. Among the loveliest of Aztec crafts were the mosaics of turquoise. Tiny pieces of the blue-green stone were fitted together with care over masks, shields, and ornaments, set into resin in intricate patterns until the whole surface shimmered like water. A few of these turquoise treasures still survive, and they remain among the most beautiful things the Aztec hands ever made. The Aztecs loved poetry deeply and held it among the highest of all arts. They called it, in a lovely phrase, flower and song, joining the two words to mean poetry, the beautiful and fleeting things of the spirit. To compose and recite poetry was honored even among kings, and gatherings were held where poems were shared and sung. The most famous of all the Aztec poets was a king, Quetzalcoatl, the ruler of Texcoco, the city allied with Tenochtitlan. He was renowned not only as a wise ruler and builder, but as a poet and thinker, and verses attributed to him still survive. His poems dwell gently on the beauty of the world and the brevity of life, on flowers that bloom and fade. Much Aztec poetry returns to that very theme, the shortness and preciousness of life. The poets compared human lives to flowers that open for a little while and then wither, and spoke of how we are here on the earth only briefly, as if in a dream. There is a tender melancholy in these verses, a quiet wonder at how beautiful and how passing all things are. Music filled Aztec life, especially at festivals. They played upright skin drums and hollow wooden drums struck to make two tones, along with flutes of clay, conch shell trumpets, rattles, and little bells. Music and dance were not mere entertainment, but sacred acts offered to the gods. and great crowds would dance together in the temple courts on festival days. The Aztecs, like other peoples of ancient Mexico, played a famous ball game. Players struck a heavy ball of solid rubber using mainly their hips, keeping it in play upon a long stone court, and in some forms trying to pass it through a stone ring set high on the wall. The game was old and sacred, tied to the movement of the heavens and watched by eager crowds. For quieter amusement, there was a board game called Patoli. Players moved markers around a cross-shaped board according to the throw of marked beans, in a game of luck and chance much like games still played today. The Aztecs were fond of wagering on Patoli, betting goods and treasures on the fall of the beans, and it was played with great enjoyment. The rulers of the Aztecs kept astonishing gardens. The great King Moctezuma was said to keep botanical gardens filled with plants gathered from across the empire, and parks and pools, and even a kind of zoo, with birds and beasts brought from distant lands. There was a great aviary, loud with the calls of brilliant tropical birds, kept simply for wonder and for beauty. The Aztecs cherished flowers above almost all things. Flowers appear everywhere in their poetry and their art, given as gifts, woven into garlands, offered to the gods, and grown in gardens for their beauty alone. To love and cultivate flowers was, to the Aztecs, a mark of a refined and gentle spirit, and the growing of them was an honored art. Their healers knew a great deal about the plants of their land and their uses. Aztec medicine drew on hundreds of herbs and remedies, carefully gathered and prepared to treat wounds and fevers and many ailments. The visitors from across the sea were impressed by the knowledge of the Aztec healers and by the great variety of medicinal plants sold in the markets. A small part of that watery garden world still survives to this day in the district of Xochimilco, on the southern edge of Mexico City. Some of the old canals and chinampas remain, still farmed, still green. Visitors drift along the waterways in flat painted boats among the floating gardens, a living echo of the lake city as it once was. For the great city of Tenochtitlan itself did not entirely vanish. After the empire fell, a new city rose upon its ruins, and that city grew into the vast, modern capital of Mexico City. Beneath its streets and plazas lie the remains of the Aztec capital, and now and then, digging in the heart of the city, workers still uncover the buried stones of the old sacred precinct. And so, the Aztec world is not as far away as it might seem. It lives on in the language and the foods of Mexico, in the chocolate and the maize and the names of things, in the flag with its eagle and cactus, and in the gardens of Xochimilco still floating upon the water. The city on the lake left a long, quiet shadow that reaches into our own day. Each of the 5 suns had its own name and its own ruling power. The first sun was a world of giants, watched over by the smoking mirror, and it ended when jaguars devoured the giants. The second was ruled by the feathered serpent as the wind, and ended in great winds. The third belonged to the rain god, and ended in a rain of fire. And the fourth to the water goddess, and ended in a flood. Each world had its god, its people, and its undoing. The present age, the 5th sun, was called For Movement, and the Aztecs believed it too would one day end, not by jaguar or wind or flood, but by great earthquakes. There was in this a deep awareness that their world was precious because it would not last forever, that it had to be cherished and upheld in the brief time it was given. The earth itself, in their telling, was made from the body of a great earth being. The old story says, the feathered serpent and the smoking mirror found a vast monster floating on the primal waters, and from her body they made the world, her hair becoming the trees and grass, her eyes the springs and caves, her mouth the rivers, her shoulders the mountains. The very land was the body of a goddess. The Aztecs pictured the cosmos in layers, stacked above and below. Above the earth rose many heavens, 13 levels climbing upward, and below it lay the realms of the underworld, 9 levels reaching down. The earth where people lived was the middle place, a thin, bright layer between the heights of the heavens and the depths below, where the sky and the underworld met. At the very top of the heavens, in the highest place of all, the Aztecs imagined a single, supreme and distant power, a dual god, both male and female together, the Lord and Lady of our flesh, from whom all things ultimately came. This highest divinity was remote and rarely worshipped directly, more a first cause than a god of festivals, the source behind the source. The Aztecs also saw the world spread out in 4 directions, each with its own color, its own meaning, and its own guardian. To the east lay the place of dawn and the rising sun. To the west, the place of the sun's descent. To the north, the cold and the realm of the dead. To the south, the place of growth and water. And at the center stood the hearth, the navel of the world. At that center burned the fire of the old god, the god of fire, one of the most ancient of all their deities. He dwelt in the hearth at the heart of every home and at the center of the world, an old, old god, keeper of the flame. The fire in the household hearth was sacred, and to let it die carelessly was a grave thing. The Aztecs believed that a person held more than one animating force within the body. There was a force seated in the head, tied to one's fate and to the warmth of life. There was another in the heart, the seat of feeling, memory, and will. And there was a third in the liver, tied to passion and breath. In this way, a human being was a meeting place of several spirits, each with its own home in the body. The ruler of the Aztecs was called the Tlatoani, a word that means the speaker, the one who speaks for the people. He was chosen from among the noble family by a council of leading men, not simply inherited by the eldest son, and he was expected to be wise, brave, and devout, a war leader, a high priest, and a judge all at once. The most famous of these rulers was Moctezuma II, who reigned at the height of the empire's glory, in the great city at the peak of its power and splendor. Around him gathered an elaborate court of nobles and servants, and his palace was vast, with countless rooms, gardens, and halls, a city within the city. Behind the throne, in the empire's rise, stood a brilliant advisor named Tlacaelel, who served several rulers and helped shape the Aztec state. Though he never took the throne himself, he was among the most powerful men of his age, guiding the policies that lifted the Mexica from a subject people to the masters of the valley. The empire was held together largely through tribute. The peoples conquered by the Triple Alliance were not always closely governed, but they were required to send regular tribute to the capital, goods of every kind flowing in from across the land. In return, they were largely left to run their own affairs. So long as the tribute kept coming, that tribute was carefully recorded in painted books, long rolls listing what each province owed. The lists are astonishing in their variety. Vast quantities of cloth and maize and beans, loads of cacao and chili, bundles of bright feathers, jade and gold, even live eagles and other rare and precious things, all flowing to Tenochtitlan from the corners of the empire, because the Aztecs had no horses and no wheeled vehicles for travel. Much was carried on the backs of porters, and word was spread by runners. Teams of swift messengers ran in relays along the roads, each carrying the message, a stretch of the way before passing it to the next, so that news could travel across the empire with remarkable speed. So swift were these relay runners that, the stories say, fresh fish caught in the sea could be carried over the mountains and laid before the ruler in his inland city while still fresh enough to eat. Across many miles and rising ground, the runners bore their burdens at a pace that astonished those who later heard of it. The lake city faced a constant danger from the water itself, for in heavy rains the lake could flood, and parts of its water were salty and bad for the crops. To master this, the Aztecs and their allies built a great dike across the lake, a long earthen wall many miles in length, separating the salty water from the fresh. That great dike was credited to the wisdom of the poet king of Texcoco, the same Quetzalcoatl, renowned for his verses. He was an engineer and builder as well as a poet, and his dike held back the salt water, keeping the western lake fresh around the city and its floating gardens. protecting the chinampas on which the people depended. The Aztecs honored warriors, and a man could rise in the world through courage in battle. There were proud orders of warriors, the eagle warriors and the jaguar warriors, who dressed in the guise of those fierce creatures and were honored for their deeds. A common man who proved himself brave could win rank, fine clothing, and standing he could never have gained otherwise. Yet, for all the honor given to warriors, the Aztecs prized many other virtues too, and their teachings urged moderation, honesty, humility, and self-control. The counsels handed down to the young warned against pride and excess and idleness, and praised the steady, modest, hard-working life. To be a good person was held to matter as much as to be a brave one. The festivals of the Aztecs followed the turning of the farming year. Each of the 18 months of the solar calendar had its own great festival, and many of these were tied to the cycle of the maize and the coming of the rains. There were ceremonies for the planting and ceremonies for the harvest, for the first rains and for the ripening of the corn. Some festivals were given over wholly to flowers and to joy. There were times of feasting and dancing, of music in the temple courts, of garlands and offerings of blossoms, when the people celebrated the gods of beauty and growth and renewal. The Aztec year was woven through with these gatherings, marking the seasons with color and song. The priests who tended the gods and the calendars formed a learned class of their own. They kept the temples, watched the stars, painted and read the sacred books, taught in the higher schools, and guided the people through the proper days for every undertaking. To become a priest was to enter a life of study, discipline, and devotion, set apart for the service of the gods. The farmers of the chinampas had a clever way of starting their crops. They made small floating beds of reeds and mud and sowed their seeds there first, in neat little squares. When the seedlings were strong enough, they cut the squares apart and planted them out into the garden plots, so that one crop could be growing in the beds while another still ripened in the fields. By starting their plants this way, and by the endless richness of the lake mud, The chinampa farmers could raise crop after crop without rest. Some of these floating gardens are said to have yielded as many as 7 harvests in a single year, an astonishing abundance, enough to help feed the hundreds of thousands who lived in the city, on the lake, beyond the lake, on the slopes of the hills and mountains. The Aztecs farmed in other ways. They cut terraces into the hillsides, broad steps of level ground held up by stone walls, so that crops could be grown on land that would otherwise be too steep. And they dug canals to carry water to their fields, coaxing harvests from the dry highlands. From the edges of the salty lake, the people gathered salt. They let the salt water dry in the sun and scraped up what was left, or boiled it down, shaping the salt into cakes to be sold in the markets. Salt was a valuable good, needed for food and for many crafts, drawn from the same lake that gave the city its gardens and its fish. Among the flowers the Aztecs grew was the bright orange marigold, which they especially loved and which they connected with the dead and with remembrance. That same golden flower is still gathered today in Mexico to honor the dead, its petals scattered on graves and altars. The marigold of remembrance reaches back, like so much else, into the Aztec past. The Aztecs ate many foods that might surprise us, drawn from every corner of their world. They gathered grasshoppers and ate them toasted, a food still enjoyed in Mexico today. They harvested the eggs of water insects from the lake, a delicacy sometimes called the caviar of Mexico. And they ate the plump worms that lived in the maguey plant. Little was overlooked that could nourish. Their cooking was rich with flavor. They had many kinds of chili pepper, each with its own heat and taste. And they seasoned their food with fragrant herbs and seeds. They knew vanilla, drawn from the pod of an orchid, and used it to flavor their chocolate. And they had aromatic herbs and peppers that gave their dishes depth and warmth. For sweetness, the Aztecs had honey. They kept small, stingless bees native to the land, gathering their mild honey, and they drew sweet syrup from the maguey and from maize stalks. Without sugar as we know it, they still found ways to bring sweetness to their food and drink, from the bees and the plants of their own country. The maize itself came in many colors, not only the yellow we usually picture. There was white maize and red, deep blue and near black, and speckled ears of mixed colors. Each was grown and valued, and the different colors were used in different foods so that an Aztec meal might be made from corn of many hues. To turn that maize into food took patient daily labor, mostly by the women of the household. The softened kernels were ground upon a sloping stone with a stone roller, worked back and forth by hand until the maize became a smooth dough. Then the dough was patted into thin cakes and baked on a flat clay griddle over the fire, fresh for each meal. The Aztecs were devoted to cleanliness of the body. Ordinary people bathed often, and it is said that the great ruler Moctezuma bathed twice every day, alongside the steam baths. This love of washing kept the people remarkably clean, and the visitors from across the sea, who bathed far less in those times, often remarked upon it with surprise. The little hairless dog of the Aztecs was more than food. Warm to the touch, it was kept as a companion and a bed warmer, curled against its owner in the cool nights of the highlands, and it was bound up with the journey of the dead. The faithful creature thought to guide its master's soul across the dark river of the underworld. There was even a god in the shape of such a dog, a strange deity who was the twin of the feathered serpent, while Quetzalcoatl was the morning star. His dog-headed twin was the evening star, and it was he, the stories said, who guided the sun on its nightly journey through the underworld, so that it might rise again in the east each dawn. In his form as the god of the wind, the feathered serpent was given temples of an unusual shape. Where most Aztec temples were square and stepped, the temples of the wind god were built round, so that the wind, his breath, might pass around them freely without being blocked by sharp corners. A round temple in the Aztec world marked the shrine of the wind. The painters of the sacred books were skilled and honored craftsmen, and they had a special name. They prepared their bark paper and deer hide, and painted upon it with brushes, and with vivid colors made from minerals, plants, and even insects. Their work preserved the histories, the calendars, the maps, and the lore of the gods. And to paint well was a high and respected art. One of their most precious colors was a deep, brilliant red, and it came from a tiny insect. The cochineal insect lived upon the pads of the prickly pear cactus, and when it was gathered and dried and crushed, it gave a red dye of extraordinary richness. This red was prized throughout the Aztec world and, in later centuries, would be sought across the whole world for its beauty. The poet king of Texcoco built one of the most remarkable gardens of the age upon a hill. Near his city, water was carried to it by an aqueduct, and the rock itself was carved into terraces, pools, and bathing places, set among trees and flowers brought from many lands. It was a place of beauty and retreat, a garden of stone and water made by a king who loved the world's loveliness. The Aztecs governed themselves by law, with courts and judges to settle disputes and punish wrongs. The judges were expected to be honest and impartial, and the law reached even the highest in the land. Justice was taken seriously, and there were courts of different levels, rising up to the ruler himself, so that even a humble person might seek redress for a wrong. The Nahuatl language has left its mark across the map of Mexico to this day. Countless towns and places still bear Nahuatl names, often ending in sounds that meant a place, a hill, or beside the water. From the great capital to small villages, the old language lingers in the names of the land, spoken every day by people who may not even know their origin. Nahuatl was also a language of great courtesy, rich in respectful and reverential forms of speech. There were polite and elevated ways of speaking to elders and to those of high rank, gentle and elaborate turns of phrase. The Aztecs admired skillful, graceful speech, and a person who could speak well and courteously was held in high regard. The great market drew not only sellers of goods, but every kind of service. There were stalls of cooked food where one could eat, barbers to cut hair, porters to carry purchases, and healers selling their herbs and remedies. A visit to the market was a whole day's world unto itself, crowded, orderly, and alive with the business of a great city. And the canoes that filled the city's canals served as a kind of everyday transport carrying people and goods along the water. A family might travel to the market by canoe, or a farmer bring his harvest in from the chinampas by water, gliding quietly along the canals between the gardens and the houses, paddle, dipping softly in the still green water. The aqueduct that brought fresh water to the city was cleverly made, with two channels running side by side. While one channel carried the water into Tenochtitlan, the other could be closed off and cleaned, and then the flow was switched between them. In this way, the city's fresh water never had to stop, and the channels were always kept clean and clear. The great temple at the city's heart was not built all at once, but raised again and again over the years, each ruler enlarging it, building a new and larger temple right over the old one, like the rings of a tree. The temple grew in layers, the earlier shrines buried within the later, so that the final Great Pyramid held all its earlier selves, hidden inside. The two shrines atop the great temple stood side by side, one for the rain god and one for the sun and war god of the Mexica. They were painted in different colors, and the temple was so placed that on certain days of the year, the rising sun appeared to climb exactly between the two shrines, the building itself marking the turning of the seasons in light. The Aztecs sensed a kind of sacred energy running through all things, a divine power that filled the world, present in the sun and the rain, the mountains and the maize, in living things, and even in fine words and beautiful objects. The many gods were, in a way, the faces of this single pervading power, the sacred made visible in countless forms throughout the world. In their reckoning of the years, only 4 of the day signs could give their name to a year. And so the years ran in a cycle named by these 4, each paired in turn with the numbers. The years were counted by the reed, the flint knife, the house, and the rabbit, turning one after another through the long wheel of 52 years. There were special houses where the young went to learn music, song, and dance. The houses of song. There, in the evenings, boys and girls gathered to be taught the chants and dances of their people. For music and dance were sacred duties as much as joys, and to perform them well at the festivals was an honor. and an offering to the gods. The skilled feather workers lived together in their own district of the city, a community of artisans devoted to their delicate craft, passing their skills down through families. The goldsmiths, too, and other craft workers had their own quarters and their own patron gods, so that the city was a patchwork of neighborhoods, each humming with its own particular art and trade. The precious cacao for chocolate did not grow in the cool highlands where the capital stood. The cacao tree needs the warm, wet lowlands, and so the beans had to be brought from far away, carried up to the city as tribute and trade. This long journey was part of why chocolate was so costly and so prized, a luxury drawn from distant lands. The rubber for the heavy balls of the sacred ball game also came from the hot lowlands, drawn from the sap of certain trees. The Aztecs knew how to work this rubber into solid, bouncing balls, a material unknown in much of the world at that time. The bouncing of a rubber ball was itself a wonder to those who first saw it at their festivals. The Aztecs sometimes shaped figures and images out of a dough made from amaranth seeds bound with honey or syrup. These edible figures were made for the celebrations and then shared and eaten by the people. It was a gentle and joyful custom, the making of little figures of sweet grain to mark the holy days. The healers of the Aztec world were many and varied. Some set bones and treated wounds. Some knew the herbs for fevers and aches. Some tended women in childbirth. Their knowledge of the plants of Mexico was vast, gathered over generations, and much of it was later written down in books of remedies, a treasury of the old healing wisdom of the land. The mild drink of the maguey, pulque, had its own cheerful and unruly gods. The Aztecs spoke of the 400 rabbits, a great crowd of little gods of drink and merriment and excess, each rabbit a different shade of drunkenness. To say someone was as drunk as a certain number of rabbits was, to say just how far they had gone in the highest heaven of all, beyond all the others. The Aztecs placed the dwelling of the supreme dual god, a place whose name meant the place of duality. There, above every other realm, the Lord and Lady of creation dwelt together, the origin of all the gods and all the world, in a stillness far above the busy heavens below. Aztec children, like children everywhere, had their toys and their play. Small clay figures and little whistles and animal figures on wheels have been found, made as playthings. Even though the Aztecs did not use the wheel for work, childhood had its games and its small joys, even within a society that trained its young so carefully for their duties. The great market was watched over by officials and judges who sat within it to keep order, settle quarrels, and make sure that measures were honest and prices fair. To cheat in the market was a serious offence. So the vast crowds of buyers and sellers moved within a careful order, overseen by those whose task was to keep the marketplace just. The valley where the Aztecs built their world was a high bowl ringed by mountains, holding a chain of shallow lakes. Around the rim rose great peaks, and to the southeast stood two snow-capped volcanoes, towering over the valley, white against the sky. They were landmarks visible from the city, watching silently over the lake and its gardens. Those two volcanoes carried a gentle and sorrowful legend. One was a warrior and one a princess who loved each other. And when she was wrongly told that he had died, she died of grief, and he laid her body upon the mountains and knelt beside her forever. So the people saw in the two peaks a sleeping woman, and the warrior who watches over her still, the smoking mountain, and the white lady. The sacred count of days was also divided into little weeks of 13 days, 20 of them making up the 260. Each of these 13-day spans began with its own sign and was watched over by its own god, and the priests read them closely, for each span and each day within it carried its own particular fortune and meaning. The floating gardens did not only feed the city with food, they supplied it with flowers as well. Great quantities of blossoms grown on the chinampas and carried fresh into the markets each day. For the Aztecs wanted flowers for their festivals, their offerings, and the simple pleasure of beauty. The city on the lake was a city of flowers as much as of maize. The Mexica had not always been great. When they first came to the valley, they were poor and unwelcome latecomers, looked down upon by the older cities already settled around the lakes. forced to live at first on the least desirable land. From those humble and difficult beginnings they rose over a few generations to become the masters of the valley. Memory of hardship never far behind their later glory. And in the midst of all their power and splendor, the Aztec poets returned again and again to a quiet truth, that all of it was fleeting. We do not live forever on the earth. Their verses said, only a little while. The jade shatters. The gold is broken. The bright feathers tear. Even the greatest things pass, like flowers, like a song, like the brief gathering of friends beneath the sun. And so, as the night deepens, the old city settles into sleep. The canals lie still and dark, the canoes tied up along the water's edge. The great temple stands silent against the stars. The markets are empty now, the stalls packed away, the long causeways quiet across the lake. The feathered serpent drifts somewhere in the wind. The rain god rests upon his mountain. The maize stands tall and quiet in the floating gardens. The willows still along the canals. The fires burn low in 1,000 hearths across the island city. The moon climbs slowly over the lake. The water turns to silver. A single canoe drifts somewhere far out on the still water. The flowers close their petals in the dark. The drums are quiet now, and gradually the city grows faint. The lights go soft. The moonlight settles across the water, and the gardens, and the sleeping island. A last canoe slips home through the dark canals. The water grows still. The old gods keep their watch. Maize and moonlight. Still water. The soft sound of wind and the long, gentle, breathing quiet of the night.